stop and consider what we face today, or we to the early days of America and look at what they were facing then. And there's always been opposition. There's always been opposition. And so the command, the instructions for us is that we would earnestly contend for the faith. That phrase there, earnestly contend, literally means to fight. That there ought to be a willingness to fight for what we believe in. And as we go through this, we're going to find that reiterated week after week as we talk about those that stood up and fought. So today we're going to talk about seeking religious liberty. I want to go into that and show you some things that happened in early America that I think were very interesting. And I want you today, if you don't get anything else out of this today, I want you to understand that the early colonial days of America was nothing like the way that it is today. And so as we go through this series, you can't think about the way that things are. You have to go back and remember they did not have a constitution. They did not have a Bill of Rights. They did not have a First Amendment. And we're going to see why that was so necessary as we go through this today. One author says this: God needeth not the help of material sword of steel to assist the sword of the Spirit in the affairs of conscience. Any such religion cannot be a true religion which needs carnal weapons to uphold it. I want you to just consider that for a moment. We don't need carnal weapons. The battle that we fight is a spiritual battle, and we'll see that again as we go through all of this. You remember last time, several weeks back, as we talked about John Bunyan and talked about the persecution that was in England. Out of all of that, two groups came out of it. There was the Puritans and the Separatists. If you don't know, just very quickly, the Puritans wanted to purify the church. And as they wanted to look at the church, they thought that it was fixable. But we know this, some things just aren't fixable. And everything of the church, now understand what I'm referring to is the Church of England, everything about that, as you look at the way that it was corrupted, we looked at that again a few weeks back, and how it was really not something that could be fixed because it wasn't even founded on something that was right. So its foundation was flawed. But then there was on the other side the Separatists. The Separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England. I've been debating this, and I'm just thinking out loud here for just a second. I've been debating this. I understand we as Baptists are considered as separatists, but when you go back to the colonial days of the United States and you look at what a separatist was, it was somebody that was separating from the Church of England. Part of the idea of separating would mean that you were part of it at one point in time. But remember, a few weeks ago, we discovered that we were never a part of the Church of England, the Catholic Church. Never at any time. We are not Protestant. That's the point that I'm trying to make. So looking at separatists, yes, we are separated. But in that sense, I'm kind of struggling with, were we actually separatists in that day? We label a lot of Baptists as separatists, but they were never part of the Church of England, though some of them were, and we're going to meet a couple of them today. In that day, many of the dissenters fled to Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and then also to Leiden, Holland. And they thrived under the leadership of a man named John Smith. He was the pastor, very influential in that day, and really had a lot to do with the push to come into the United States. Ultimately, they found that there was a land where they could have some possibility of absolute religious liberty. That's what the news said anyway. And so in 1602, 100 members of that church were on the Mayflower as they came to the United States. And we won't take time, but you go through and they were there signing the Mayflower Compact, which was a desire at least to separate from England, to have the ability to self-rule under the auspice of being part of the government of England. So under the king, we would say. But historically, and we're going to come across this phrase many times, these are known as Dutch Baptists. The Dutch Baptists are the first Baptists to settle in America. They came to America, though, looking for two things: Two things that are very important, two things that we've dealt with already, but just very briefly. They wanted a liberty of conscience. I should be able to choose what I believe. Brother Will did a great job 2 weeks ago dealing with that. I should be able to choose what I believe and how I should worship God. We could say it was simply a freedom of belief. And then there was the freedom of observance under that as well. In other words, that I should be allowed to practice. I should be able to practice what I believe unhindered by the government, and then equal status, equal treatment under the law, regardless of what you believe. Now, these things may not seem very important or very significant, again, because we think of the way that things are now. Things were not the way that they are now, and we have to get a hold of that. So when it's talking about equal status, depending, and we're going to find this over and over again throughout, depending on what you believe depended upon how the government was going to treat you. If you did not fall in line and if you did not think like they did, then you would suffer the persecution that would come. So we find the liberty of conscience. The second thing is just simply the separation of government and church. Now, again, that may seem like a small thing. It may seem like it's not that big of a deal, but that is huge. The separation of church and government. We saw under Constantine a few weeks back. Remember how difficult everything was under Constantine? He took the church, he saw the power that the Church of England had, and he decided to marry it with the government. And so basically, he had all of the power. He had the power in governmental matters. He had the power in religious matters, putting those two together. And of course, he became a tyrant because of that. Some would look at the things that he did as good things. There was not good that came from it. So that's what they came to America looking for. The Dutch Baptists did. Did they get what they were looking for? Sadly, they did not. They did not. Not even close to what they had envisioned, because the churches would set up in the United States, again, not the United States, but in the colonies at that time, and they were just like England. They only had one way of thinking. Now, we could fault them for all of this, but they only had one way of thinking because that's the way most of the world ran at that point. After Constantine's influence, we find that church and religion, or church and government came together in so many different ways that became the global way of doing things. And so, though they were wrong in a sense, we can't necessarily fault for what they were doing. It's the way that everything functioned at that time. So what they did then is they would persecute those that would dissent. If you didn't fall in line, if you didn't believe it, they would persecute you. Consider this. It was unlawful and punishable as a crime to neglect or, I'm going to start over. It was unlawful and punishable as a crime to neglect or oppose the existing or standing church. We're going to see that phrase a lot, the standing church or the standing order that was there. Or to set up worship in opposition to it. You could not worship, you could not have a church service outside of their authority that they had, or to refuse to be taxed for the support of its ministry. So not only that you were forced to be a part of them, you were forced to pay taxes to them. It didn't matter if you believed. So consider this, if we're here in Spokane, that we were taxed to support the ministry of the Catholic Church down the road. That's exactly what was going on. It didn't matter if you believed. That was the government, and that's the way it was. You could not oppose the faith of that church, and you could not build houses of worship because they would be considered dissenting churches. So hopefully you get the idea of that there was an ultimate power, an absolute power that came with them. So the Puritans at that time, in the early 1600s, was the dominant religion or dominant church in most areas. This would include the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the Congregational Church. All of them had the ties, in some ways had separated from the Church of England, but they still had the same influence that was always there. This was the case in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We're going to spend a lot of time over the next few weeks because the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or Boston more particularly, became a hot spot of persecution for Baptists. They were especially persecuted there because of their opposition, among many other things, but their opposition to infant baptism. Of all, you think about that, how how such a minor thing in what they believed and where they came up with infant baptism. It had nothing to do, of course, with the Bible. But they also opposed that unregenerated church membership. So in other words, anybody could come and be a member of the church. They didn't have to be saved. They could just come and join. We're going to find later on in history that becomes a huge hot plate issue. But then also, as we've mentioned before, the union of church and state. So November 12th of 1644, the General Court passed a law that banished those who refused to accept infant baptism and the use of secular force in religious things. That last phrase, we understand the opposition of infant baptism, but think about the secular force in religious things. John Bunyan, if you go back to that, and if you read through his court, basically what John Bunyan was saying is the government has no authority to tell somebody what to believe. No authority whatsoever, but the government tried to do that. That's why John Bunyan ended up spending 12 years in prison. It was because there was a secular force in religious things. And so this law, as they passed it, had the opposite effect that they had desired, because the Baptists began to spread even in greater number because they were persecuted, which it's awesome because you find this throughout American history with the Baptists. When they are persecuted, they're persecuted so that they would be put aside, so that they would be silenced, and almost the opposite happened almost every time, that the Baptist would end up doing a whole lot better. So I want to introduce you to a few different people. The first one is a man named Roger Williams. He once faced persecution because of opposition to several different laws that we'll look at here in just a minute, but just a little bit about him. He was born around 1600 in England, and he was influenced heavily by John Smith and the Dutch Baptists in their pursuit of religious liberty. He was well ahead of his time in several different areas, but he came to the United States around 1630, and he went to Boston. Now, we're going to see a little bit more about the laws here in just a minute. But like the Dutch Baptists, they came hoping for this religious liberty and got here and found the total opposite. Roger Williams faced the same thing. And so when he came to America, he was considered such a godly man that the religious community, in other words, the Congregational Church, they saw how spiritual he was and how godly of a man that he was, that they wanted him to come and be the pastor. Again, the church was a Congregational church, and because of that, it was ruled by 25 to 30 deputies. They have kind of a nickname historically as the Black Hats. For obvious reasons, they were wearing black hats. They weren't very creative in their names back then. But they looked at him, these 25 to 30 men looked at him and said, this guy is unique. We want him to come, and we want him to be the pastor of our church here. Excuse me. Now consider this. Because these black hats were the leaders in the church, what else would that mean because of the other things that we've learned? Well, they're also going to be leaders in the government. So the two, again, are here together. That's the opposite of what Roger Williams wanted when he came, and so he rejected their offer, and we'll say more about that here in just a minute. But while in England, something happened to him. He got saved, obviously, but he was a Puritan, but now things had changed in his whole perception of everything, especially seeing the way that things were in Boston. He became a separatist. But let me just clarify this. Just because someone is a separatist does not make them Baptist. Okay? We need to get a hold of that. Just because somebody is a separatist does not make them Baptist. You cannot be a Baptist without being a separatist, but you can be a separatist without being a Baptist. Okay? Hopefully that didn't confuse you. We'll show here in just a little bit. Roger Williams did a lot, and some people have credited him as being the first pastor of the First Baptist Church in America. He was not a Baptist, okay? I'll show you that here in just a few minutes. But he was very significant for the Baptists because of his beliefs. He saw how Puritan the church was, and he was not going to be a Puritan. He saw, and so he declined the offer to be the pastor of the Congregational Church in Boston, and ultimately would move to Salem, which was still in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he would become the religious leader there. While he was there, several laws were passed. I want to discuss a few of these. The first one was the oath of a free man. Now, I'm going to go through these rather quickly. They are significant, and hopefully you'll understand what's wrong with these laws. In March of 1635, the Boston court passed this ordinance, and it was required for all men who were 16 and older, and on its surface, it seemed to break from England, which is what people were leaning towards at that time. They wanted that break from England. But there was a couple of things that were a problem here. There had to be a swearing of allegiance to the new standing order. In other words, the Congregational Church. They had to swear in allegiance to it. The second thing was that they had to agree to abide by the laws of New England, both civil and religious. So it didn't matter what it was, they would understand, okay, we all get you should obey the civil laws, but when it came to religious matters, they were supposed to follow those as well. And the membership of that was only by infant baptism. So are you seeing why this is nothing like what Roger Williams had set out to try and find? It was all about, again, governmental control. So this actually, if you look at the oath of a free man, this actually became the normal government for what we know as the United States, those colonies, for the next about 160 years. And that's the way that things were. And again, that's what I want you to understand in this lesson, is that things were way different than what we are. The oath of a free man was a big deal. The lawbreakers, the ones that would not fall in line, they were all of the religious sort, as it stated. Their homes would be stolen, properties would be taken, they could be banished, or they could even be hanging. There are some records of people that were hanged because of not falling in line. Roger Williams preached against this, very openly preached against it, and said that he was not going to take an oath because the oath that he would take would be only to God, and that was it. There was a little bit of flaw in some of his thinking as he goes later on with this mentality. He was called before the Boston court April 30th of 1665 and basically refused to change what he was preaching. He wasn't going to apologize. He was going to keep doing that. The second law was the law of patents. Now this is interesting, and he was, again, I said earlier, Roger Williams was ahead of his time. This is where we'll find that he was way ahead of his time. It stated that a Christian king could lay claim to any lands discovered by a Christian explorer, and it took no concern for those who lived there previously. And if you know what America was before it was settled by the colonists, the colonists, you understand why that was such a big deal. So anybody that was living on the land, if it was a Christian king and if it wasn't a Christian explorer, and again, they're using that term very, very, very loosely, that they had the rights to that land. So early on, they could drive the Indians out and say, well, it's because we're Christian that we can come in and we can take the land that was there. Again, Roger Williams had the passion to go and purchase land from Indians, and he would do that. We'll see here in just a little bit. Here's something that Roger Williams had to say about that. The sin of patents lay heavy on my mind, especially that part of which Christian kings were invested with a right by the virtue of their Christianity to take and give away the land and countries of other men. No doubt he was mostly referring to the Indians of that day, the Native Americans. He was rebuked by John Cotton, the mayor of Boston, who again was also a religious leader. But the thinking that drove all this was this. It was real simple. The Puritans viewed America as a new Israel. It was a new Israel. So as they looked at the way America was, they could conquer America the same way that Israel did when they went into the promised land. And so they started thinking that way, which is what really led them down the path of persecuting anybody that was going to disagree with them. So they threatened Roger Williams with banishment to England to answer to the Church of England. The next law, the first table of the law, the state had a duty to enforce the first part of the Ten Commandments, man's responsibility to God. Now, isn't that interesting? Again, you find the government saying, we're going to force you to do the things that are what religion is. Again, the first 5 commandments, which is the man's responsibility to God. They were forcing people to choose to serve God. That, folks, is anti-Bible. That is anti-Bible. I know we've proved that 2 weeks ago. Brother Will did a good job talking about individual soul liberty that proved the error of that way. And again, if you weren't in agreement, you faced imprisonment, banishment, confiscation of property, and even death. Many interpretations of the first 5 commandments came from, in that day, they came from the Catholic Church. And so it was the Catholic Church's view of those commandments that became the main thing. Anybody that dissented, of course, would be then, because of the Catholic Church's influence, anybody that was dissenting would be accused of blasphemy because it was against those first 5 commandments. We could go back and study out back in England and in Europe, the Donatists, the Waldenses, and the Albigenses, and what they had to face simply because of this exact principle that we're talking about. Among all of those that were back in Europe, John Calvin was one of them. And if you have a high opinion of John Calvin, just remember that he burned these heretics, also known as Baptists. Zwingli, who was really a counterpart in Switzerland, also drowned those that would oppose. So this first table of the law is something that went all the way back to England and to Europe. And so then what they would call rebaptism, which is a oxymoron, rebaptism became a blasphemous offense, which usually resulted in death. Another thing took place because of the opposition of this and because of the Boston court being against Roger Williams, the Land for Preacher deal. The Land for Preacher deal. So he stood up in court and defied everything that they were saying, and he refused to say that he was going to conform to them. He refused to change what he was going to preach. And again, the whole gist of it was that they felt like they had the power over religion. And because of that, they acted quickly. And so they told Salem that, we understand where you are, talking to the whole city now of Salem. And again, the religious community in particular, that they would let them keep him if they would give or they would sell him some land if they would just compromise. Sadly, they compromised. And so now Roger Williams is going to be banished. Initially, he was supposed to go back to England as was promised before. He was banished in September of 1636 to return to England. But when it came time for them to get him and to banish him, he was nowhere to be found. He was actually 3 days in the wind. They couldn't find him at that point. And so they altered his sentence because of that. And they sent him to what they referred to as the sewer of New England, which is Rhode Island. He arrived at the Narragansett Bay 14 weeks after, and as he arrived there, he was a fugitive. There were uncolonized native Indians there that belonged to the Narragansett tribe. His first order of business was to purchase land from the Indians. Not to drive them out, not to fight them, but to actually purchase the land. He lived on principle. So he, his wife, 2 children, and 11 followers settled on this land. One quote from Roger Williams: "I testify and declare in the holy presence of God that at my first coming into these parts, I obtained the lands where now by God's merciful providence we are." There's a key word in that statement that he says, and that is providence. Providence. So, very quickly, was he a Baptist? The reason he was not a Baptist, there was no Baptist church authority of his baptism. You'll understand we as Baptists take that very seriously. He and another man decided that the Baptist way, or the baptism after salvation, was correct, and so they just together went out into the river and baptized each other. There was no authority of that, and not to mention that, but later on in his life, he would recant many of the things that he stood up for as well. But he settled nonetheless in Providence, Rhode Island. In August of 1837, they wrote and they signed the Providence Compact, which is a very key document. You can see there on the screen. It was particularly leaning towards and suggesting in very many ways the freedom of worship there. But this sets the stage for going on from here, because we find after this that we go from Boston to Baptist. Now we're going to get into the Baptist. There was a debate between the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and the Presbyterians in Boston, and really the whole Massachusetts Bay colony. And really the great debate was, where does religion begin and end, and where does government authority begin and end? An awesome question, wouldn't you say? Really some things that should be considered. And of course, because of the influence of the Church of England, many of them went the wrong direction. So Boston, by the 1630s, again, this is just after about 10 years of what we've looked at here, Boston was in an uproar because of the religious differences and the laws that had been passed. This experimental government met its match because they desired religious control, just like Constantine did. You go back to that, we're not seeing a whole lot of different. It's a whole lot of the same kind of thing as you get into the early days here in Boston. So the Puritans, again, they wanted to purify the church, and they were very, very heavily Calvinistic. The Separatists simply wanted the right to worship how they believed that they should. They believed that everyone should have that right. They believed that that was a point of liberty, and they also believed that the Bible should be the rule for worship. Now again, doesn't that sound very Baptist-like? I mean, in the Baptist acrostic, the B-A-P-T-I-S-T-S, remember what the B is. The Baptist is the sole authority in all things faith and practice. And so we find that's not a new principle that we just came up with. It's been around for all of Baptist history and Christian history. Another hot debate became the merits of one's salvation. How can somebody actually know that they're saved? And this really would show, probably in about the next 50 years or so, it would show up because salvation became less and less and less and less of a priority. As I said earlier, unregenerated church membership. In other words, anybody, it doesn't matter if they're saved or not, could come and could be a member of the church. This became the big debate even for the political leaders. There's a man named John Cotton. He was a religious leader in Massachusetts as well as the governor. Again, the two being married together, obviously. He had two terms for these people. There were the opinionists who stated that salvation was by faith through grace. And then there was the orthodox, which was that said that works was necessary for salvation. So these were really the two sides. This debate went into homes, and in these homes, as the debate went, these became meetings that were not allowed, and so people would be arrested because of these meetings. One of them was in the home of Ann Hutchinson. Her and her husband and several others were there. She was an opinionist. She held meetings in her house to discuss these and was ultimately hauled before the court and was about to be banished. And she was accused by the Boston court of having a masculine spirit, denying the resurrection, and threatening a subversion of peaceable order of government. All fake news. All of it. I mean, everything that they said about her was just stuff that they said, well, we got to have some kind of a charge, so let's just make a bunch of stuff up. And so that's what they did. And because of that, there were several consequences. One of them because of these meetings and this one in particular, 15 men were disenfranchised. You can see what that means. And then 76 of them, of the men there in Boston, were disarmed. Why would they want to disarm them? You're getting the idea of what America was back in that day. You're getting the idea why the Second Amendment is kind of a big deal to us today. They disarmed them because they knew that they were against what the government was saying and what they were doing. And so laws were eventually passed that you could not defend your position if it disagreed with the church or government. You could disagree all you wanted, you just couldn't say it out loud. You couldn't tell anybody about it. You couldn't have the discussions with people. I think you're probably getting the idea. Things were a lot different back in that day than they are. So consider this is what Boston is. Now I want to introduce you to another man, and we'll finish on him. A man named Dr. John Clark. And I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say this. One of the most important people in American history, not just in Baptist history. Okay, we're going to see he's going to come up several times in the influence that he had with many people. So he comes to Boston, and things are the way they are, November of 1637. And he was an interesting man. He was saved in his 20s, separated from the Church of England shortly after that. He was a Baptist, come from England. So he was a Baptist before he even came to the colonies. He was also a medical doctor. He came to America for the purpose, actually, of helping people medically. He wanted to be able to use his abilities, his skills as a doctor, to be able to help people. But he saw what Boston had become. And I would even surmise that Boston was probably worse than things were back in England. But he saw what things was and the way that things were, and he did what men should do. He acted. He got busy. He got involved, and he started doing everything he could to have an influence there. So he became the leader of some, and long story short, they ended up getting banished. And they went to New Hampshire after they were banished. There were 18 families in all. The cold winter of 1637 caused them to move. Cold weather would make them move. I totally relate to that. They got away from it as quick as they possibly could. So they set sail, hoping to find Delaware. That's where they were going. But you'll never guess where they ended up. They ended up in the Narragansett Bay. The Narragansett Bay. Do you remember why that's important? That's where Roger Williams had settled. So shortly after they got there, they found Roger Williams, and they, by his help, were able to go and to get to know the Indians, to get acquainted with the Indians, and not to come in and push them out as the nature of so many of them was. And so they ended up purchasing some land. He recommended them to go to Aquidneck Island. And now in that place, this is significant because they were out of the Pilgrim and Puritan jurisdictions at this point in time. And so they purchased the island from the Indians in 1638. And he was very adamant, again, about that they would purchase the island. And the name of the island was the Isle of Rhodes. They started meeting as a church under the leadership of Dr. John Clark. So now we find this new place that is being founded in the Isle of Rhodes, Rhode Island, as we know it. And then we find that they ultimately would settle in what is now Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and it became really the shaping of America. A very important document at this point in time was written. March 7th of 1638, the Portsmouth Compact was written. I believe, now I encourage you to study this out in a whole lot more depth, and you'll come, I believe, to the same conclusion. This is one of the most important days in American history. This is one of the most important days in Baptist history, but I could even go as far to say this is probably one of the most important days in world history. So why are you being so dramatic about this? Well, it's this simple. The purpose of the Portsmouth Compact was to set up a new independent colony that was Christian in character but non-sectarian in government. What does that mean? It was just government. It wasn't church and government. It wasn't the two being together. So we find that as that was the case here, we find this document has been called the first instrument for governing as a true democracy. So it's the first governmental document protecting a religious opinion, separating church and state, having the right to be able to have any kind of protection of religious liberty. Why is that so significant? This has never happened in all of world history. This is the first time. This is new. And now they call this an experimental government. Later on, we'll make reference to that several times. But this has never happened before. That's why I say even in world history, this is one of the most important, most significant days, because this document was agreed upon, and as they agreed upon it, it set in motion things that would come that would ultimately have an influence on the Constitution and then even the Bill of Rights after that. So all of the framework is there then for those documents to be written. Massachusetts, on the other hand, the colony there, was on the total opposite end of spectrum. Government and church needed to be married. They needed to have a firm grasp. They needed to have a fierce control of everything that they were doing. So they started passing more laws, because that's the way you solve problems in that type of society. They enacted a compulsory tax to pay for and support all religious ministers that were part of the state church. And so again, as we mentioned earlier, the taxation without representation began where it was about, you're going to pay for the pastor of the Congregational church, whether you like him or not, whether you go to that church or not, whether you agree with him or not, you're going to have to pay the taxes to support them. So the general population had absolutely no vote in this tax. And again, we find that they're becoming more and more like England. Soon after this, these laws started being passed. Many of those that were with Dr. John Clark, they moved south to the south end of the island and founded Newport in 1638, Newport, Rhode Island. They started meeting as a church under the leadership of Dr. John Clark, and it would eventually be fully established as the First Baptist Church in America in 1644. So some would credit Roger Williams. I don't think that credit is right. I don't agree with it at all, but I do agree that Dr. John Clark was the first Baptist pastor in an organized church in the colonies in America. And so we have to remember that, because he's going to have a profound influence on so many others. We'll see more about him next week as well. So by the late 1640s, Connecticut started taking over Rhode Island, and Rhode Island says, hey, we have this law that's already been passed. You can't come in and just start taking land for us. And so he appealed to the king, King Charles II, in 1663. So this is kind of an interesting thing. There were so many things going on with King Charles II at that point in time. He was almost bothered that he would have to even look at this Portsmouth Compact and their battle against Connecticut coming in and taking over, that he was so distracted by everything else, he just, in a sense, said, just give me the paper so I can sign it. He didn't even really understand what he was signing, but that doesn't really matter, because they had then granted by the king their ability to rule themselves outside of the authority of any, that included King Charles II. Interesting, isn't it? But again, we could call this the hand of providence, could we not? I think it was God working things that would work. And here's what ultimately was stated after it was all said and done. Our royal will and pleasure is that no person within said colony at any time hereafter shall in any wise be molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for differences of opinion in matters of religion. There it is. They were given that religious liberty. They had it. It was there. First time in all of world history that this was done. It's a totally new concept. It's a totally new way of thinking, which, by the way, that's what we live under today. This compact was so important to us. A little bit more, Dr. John Clark would die in 1776. Think about that, just 100 years before America declared its independence. But his work would play a huge part in it. You see this chart here. We're going to refer to this chart probably just about every week. You can kind of see it on the big. I know you probably can't make out all of it, but you can kind of see the part where we, can you click, Jonathan? Where we are looking at is there on the top left. So you kind of see just that little bit is where we're at right now. We're going to stay here for a little while because this time frame is when everything is being shaped, like the Portsmouth Compact and things like that. So take these thoughts with you and understand there were people like Roger Williams, there were people like Dr. John Clark that stood up and fought for something that they believed, and they believed it firmly. We ought to earnestly contend for the faith, and we ought to still do that today and remember that. Let's pray. Lord, we're thankful for your providence, thankful that you work in an amazing way, even in our history. Help us to learn from that, and Lord, learn to trust you even more, but help us to realize the necessity for us to stand up, for us to fight, even in the society that we are facing today. Pray that you continue to meet with us and help us. We'll thank you. We ask in Christ's name. Amen.